They said he got the leftovers, while everyone else received beachfront properties, stocks, and antique cars. Ethan was handed a single rusted key to a stable, a crumbling, sagging wooden box, tucked behind a field no one remembered. The family called it a joke. His cousin laughed out loud. His aunt shook her head with pity. Even the lawyer reading the will paused, as if embarrassed on Ethan's behalf. But Ethan didn't flinch. Not because he wasn't hurt, but because, deep inside, he expected nothing more. After all, he was the one they never really spoke about unless they had to. The only openly gay member of the family. The polite omission at holidays. The name they skipped over in group photos. The will had been read in the library of the family's estate. Its walls still hung with portraits of proud men in military coats and somber women in pearls. A family of legacy, of appearances, of silence. Ethan stood into the corner, invisible in plain sight, until the lawyer finally turned to him and said, "And to Ethan, the late Mr. Godfrey Leaves, the stable behind the southern orchard. And this? A small envelope, a single sheet of handwritten paper, folded with care. The ink was fading. The message was short. You will understand when you are ready to stand on your own, grandfather." It wasn't signed with love, not even a name, just the weight of expectation and an unfinished sentence. But it was more than Ethan had hoped for. That evening, while his relatives toasted champagne to new assets and made dinner reservations, Ethan stood alone beside the dusty window of the guest house, holding the key between his fingers. He thought about walking away, about never returning, about leaving the whole family behind again. But something held him in place. He remembered being 5 years old, sitting in his grandfather's lap, hearing the story of how their land was once a sanctuary for people fleeing war and hatred. He remembered the way his grandfather whispered about things the town was never ready to know. And he remembered the stable, not the building, but the smell of hay, the sound of rain on the roof, and the warmest memory of all his grandfather holding his hand, whispering, "One day, this place will matter again." It had been 2 decades since that moment, and now Ethan was being sent back to the very place that had once held him close. But even then, he remembered something else, something colder. His mother had once dragged him into a counselor's office, clutching a church pamphlet, hoping prayer could fix what she refused to name. She never asked how he felt, only whether he'd changed. The next morning, while the others prepared paperwork for auctions and tax exemptions, Ethan packed a single bag and drove 6 hours south, to a part of the state the GPS barely recognized. The road narrowed, trees thickened, cell signal disappeared, and then the stable came into view. It looked worse than he remembered. The roof slouched under its own weight. Ivy climbed the walls like it had a score to settle. The doors hung askew. But Ethan stepped out of the car and walked toward it, not with disappointment, but with purpose, because something in him had changed. He wasn't there for property value. He wasn't there to renovate and sell. He was there to find out why a man who said nothing in life had left him the only thing he still cared about in death. He turned the key. The lock protested. The hinges cried. The air inside was dry, thick with dust and time. But the moment he stepped in, he felt something that stunned him. Stillness. Not abandonment, not ruin, but presence. The kind that lingers after truth has been buried. There were no horses, no saddles, just silence and shadows. But in the far corner of the stable, partially hidden beneath a sagging canvas, was something large, carved in stone. Ethan didn't touch it. Not yet. He simply stood there, surrounded by the smell of wood and memory, letting it all sink in. He didn't know it yet, but the key hadn't opened a stable. It had opened a story that was never meant to stay hidden. If you've ever been handed less because of who you are, this story is for you. Subscribe to Heart Stories to follow Ethan's journey. His inheritance was never about property. It was about legacy. And what he finds next will shock everyone who once laughed at him. The sun hung low behind the trees, as Ethan stepped deeper into the forgotten stable. Dust floated like foam in the amber light. His boots echoed on the wooden floor, soft at first, then hollow. Something was buried beneath. In the far left corner, under layers of canvas and dirt, he found it, a stone platform, smooth in some places, chipped in others. He knelt, brushing it clean with his bare hands. Carved into the surface were symbols he didn't recognize, arranged in perfect symmetry, circles within circles, a single engraved line in the center. Words, faint, almost erased by time. He snapped a photo, unsure of what he was seeing, and stepped back. The next morning, he drove into town, a place frozen in time. The diner still sold coffee for $1. The hardware store's sign hadn't changed since the Reagan era. Locals glanced at him like they'd seen a ghost, or maybe just a stranger they weren't sure they'd welcome. Ethan asked about stonemasons, about restorers, about anyone who might know how to read a carved floor in a forgotten stable. Most people shrugged. One man leaned across the counter and said, "You should speak to Miles. Works out near the chapel ruins. Fixes things that nobody else dares to touch." It took Ethan 3 attempts to find the small shed where Miles worked. The man inside was quiet, deliberate in movement. Dark beard, grease-stained hands, eyes like weathered glass, soft, but hard to read. Ethan showed him the photo. Miles stared for a long time. "You know what this is?" he finally asked. Ethan shook his head. "This isn't just stonework," Miles said. "It's ceremonial, early French colonial. Some families used it for private rites, things the church didn't approve of." He paused. "Where'd you find it?" Ethan hesitated. "My grandfather's stable. He left it to me." Miles raised an eyebrow. "He was Godfrey Mason's grandson." Ethan nodded. "Oh, I heard stories," Miles said quietly, "about that land, that family." And they didn't speak more that day, but Miles agreed to come by and take a look in person. When he arrived the next morning, he walked the stable slowly, like he was remembering something rather than seeing it for the first time. He touched the beams, knocked on the wood, measured the distance between posts. Then he said something Ethan didn't expect. "This isn't a stable." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean? This was never meant for horses. The layout is wrong, the foundation's too deep, and that stone," Miles pointed, "that's an altar." Ethan stared at him. "Your grandfather built a chapel," Miles said. It didn't make sense. The Godfrey he knew had never been religious. Stern, private, respected, yes, but not spiritual. Ethan returned to the house that evening, torn between disbelief and something deeper recognition. He remembered the way his grandfather used to sit alone on the porch, staring into the woods, the way he never joined family prayers, the way he avoided church, yet kept a stack of old journals in his study, always locked. That night, Ethan climbed to the attic of the old farmhouse, where dust blanketed forgotten trunks. In one of them, he found a journal, leather-bound, brittle, pages yellowed like autumn leaves. The handwriting was sharp, precise, familiar. April 6, 1961, I saw him again. We met under the walnut tree. I cannot write his name here, not yet, but I remember the way he looked at me. The world forgets people like us. This place won't. I'll make sure of it. Ethan closed the book, his heart pounding. He wasn't imagining it. The altar, the carved symbols, the silence around the inheritance. It was all connected to a story no one in the family had dared to tell. In a hidden drawer, Ethan found a photo of 2 men standing so close they almost touched. One of them, unmistakably his grandfather. He stared at it for a long time, unable to look away. It felt like the air had thickened, like the room itself was watching. He remembered a story once shared online. 2 men in Mississippi secretly wed in a barn in 1954 with only cows as witnesses. Their photo, found decades later, had gone viral. People said it felt like looking at history no one taught. This was his version of that photo. The next few days were a blur of repair and restoration. Miles returned with tools, wood, and patience. Together, they uncovered what time had tried to erase. Behind a false wall, they found relics, candle holders, a broken cross, and a box of letters bound with a ribbon so faded it looked like smoke. Ethan opened one. "You once told me that if the world would not let us marry, we'd build a place that would. I thought you were dreaming, but you did it. You made it real. And I stood beside you as we said vows only the walls could hear." He couldn't breathe. This was more than a chapel, more than a stable. It was a sanctuary. A place of resistance. A hidden altar where two men had once exchanged promises in defiance of everything around them. And now it belonged to him. That night, as wind swept through the cracked boards and moonlight painted shadows across the altar floor, Ethan stood in the center of the room and whispered to the air, "I see it now." It began with a decision quiet, firm, and without applause. Ethan stood at the center of the hidden chapel, surrounded by dust, splinters, and memory. He looked around the space that once sheltered a forbidden love and whispered to himself, "I won't let it stay forgotten." Then he reached for his phone and called Miles. "We're getting married," he said. Miles didn't answer immediately. Then, simply, "Here," Ethan nodded, even though Miles couldn't see it. Here, plans came together slowly, not because of logistics, but because of resistance. The town had lived in silence for so long. It wasn't sure how to handle a ceremony that spoke openly. When Ethan applied for a local permit to host an event, the town clerk looked over her glasses and asked, "In that stable?" He said yes. By the following week, word had spread. Small towns don't need social media to carry whispers. They live on glances, folded arms, quiet judgment. Ethan could feel it each time he walked into a store. The eyes, the half smiles that faded when he passed, the polite silence that said, "We remember your family, but not like this." But he didn't stop. He rebuilt the altar with Miles, cleaned the benches, trimmed the vines, patched the roof. He reached out to old friends. Some said they couldn't come. Others didn't respond at all. One aunt called and begged him not to go through with it. "Do what you want," she whispered, "but don't tie our name to it." And then his mother showed up. She hadn't called, hadn't visited the stable, just appeared on the front steps of the farmhouse with that same stiff posture she'd carried since his teenage years, the kind that said love had rules and conditions. She looked at him as if he were still a child, standing with scraped knees and too many questions. "I heard," she said. Ethan didn't respond. Her eyes moved past him, toward the field, the old wooden building standing half reborn in the golden light. "This isn't what your grandfather wanted," she continued. "He was a proud man. He built that place with his hands." Ethan met her gaze. "And he left it to me." She didn't argue, just turned away and walked to her car, leaving the smell of her expensive perfume and silence behind her. The day before the wedding, the florist canceled. The baker pulled out. Even the local minister declined, saying he had other obligations. Miles offered to cancel the whole thing, but Ethan shook his head. "They don't have to believe in it. We do." That night, they lit candles across the chapel walls. Friends who still believed drove in from far cities, bringing foldable chairs and wildflowers from roadside fields. Someone brought an old record player. Another brought homemade wine. And just before midnight, in the quiet before dawn, Ethan found another envelope. It was tucked beneath the altar floorboards, sealed, untouched. His name written in ink that had bled from age. He opened it with shaking hands. "If you found this, then you've chosen to come back. That means you're ready. I built this place not because I was brave, but because I was afraid. Afraid of losing her. Afraid the world would erase us if we didn't leave something behind. You are that something. You are the proof that we were here, that we loved, that we mattered." Ethan folded the letter and pressed it to his chest. But that wasn't all. Between two brittle pages of an old Bible, Ethan found a certificate not issued by any court, but by hand, 2 names, a date, and one line bound not by law but by love. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the altar, watching the candlelight flicker against the walls that had seen so much and still stood. Morning came slowly. Guests began to arrive, just a handful, not enough to fill the pews, but they brought warmth, open arms, tears they didn't apologize for. No cameras, no live stream, just presence. Ethan wore a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled. Miles stood barefoot at the altar, his hands shaking not from fear, but from wonder. And when they looked at each other, the air seemed to pause. They said no vows out loud. They simply placed their hands together on the altar, where two men once risked everything to do the same, and looked into each other's eyes as if to say, now it's our turn. Outside, birds sang like nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. And just as the ceremony ended, as the last candle threatened to die out, there was a knock. A journalist stood at the entrance, not from the local paper, but from a national magazine. He had heard rumors of a stable, a wedding, a buried past. He asked if he could come in. Ethan looked at Miles, then stepped aside and said, "Only if you are here to listen." The story wasn't just about them anymore. It was about all those who were never allowed to have one. They hadn't planned on a crowd, but by the time the ceremony photos began to circulate online, shared by a friend who uploaded a few quiet snapshots of Ethan and Miles under the canopy of wildflowers, people began to arrive. First, it was two strangers who'd read about the stable wedding in a local Facebook group, then a journalist, then an elderly man with a pin in the shape of a triangle, who whispered that he hadn't attended a wedding since his partner died in '89. The story spread like wind through dry grass. The stable that once held secrets was now holding headlines. Some were kind, hidden love story comes full circle. Others less so, gay couple exploits dead grandfather's property for activism. The backlash came fast. Within hours, Ethan's name trended, then tumbled beneath a wave of comments. Some accused him of fabricating history. Others called it disrespectful to the dead. And a few went so far as to email the local historic society, demanding the structure be investigated and potentially torn down. Ethan read them all. He sat at the same wooden bench where he'd once read his grandfather's letter and tried not to flinch. He didn't regret the wedding, but he hadn't expected the noise. Miles stayed close. He'd always been the quieter one, the one who worked with his hands, not words. But that night, while Ethan scrolled through messages full of fire, Miles returned from the back of the stable holding the black and white photograph they'd found days ago. Two men, one of them unmistakably Ethan's grandfather, the other, now more familiar. Miles stared at it for a long time, then sat beside Ethan and whispered, "That's my grandfather, Louis Marchand." Ethan turned to him. "He helped build this place." Miles continued, "I grew up hearing stories, but they never made sense. I thought he was just a hired hand. Quiet, never married, died with nothing." He looked down at the photo again. "I didn't know what it meant until now." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was sacred. Two men decades ago who had loved in the shadows. And now, two grandsons standing in the same place, piecing together a history denied its own language. Ethan placed the photo in a small wooden frame and hung it above the altar, not as decoration, as restoration. Later that week, an LGBTQ historical society reached out. They had heard about the ceremonies, the legacy, the stable. They wanted to help preserve it, not as a monument to pain, but as a sanctuary for memory. Ethan and Miles agreed, but not everyone did. Ethan's mother left a voicemail. "You've turned grief into theater," she said. "Your grandfather would be ashamed." But Ethan didn't call back. Not because he hated her, but because he no longer needed her permission to exist. The local news crew came next. They asked questions, took footage, tried to stir controversy. One reporter asked, "What would you say to those who believe this wedding was staged for attention?" Ethan looked at the old stone wall behind him. "At least now," he replied. Someone's paying attention to what they tried to bury. He walked away before they could twist his words, because the real story was never about a wedding. It was about two men who never got one. It was about the way love endures even when silence tries to swallow it. And it was about how history, when given the chance, always finds a way to speak. In the weeks that followed, the stable transformed. Not just in appearance, though walls were scrubbed, flowers replanted, beams reinforced, but in purpose. Ethan and Miles turned it into a place where forgotten stories were invited to speak. They named it the Quiet Light. Not a museum, not a monument. A space for LGBTQ+ elders to gather, youth to learn, and families to remember those they once silenced. They filled one wall with framed letters, another with scanned black and white photographs. In a small glass case, they placed the handwritten marriage certificate Ethan found in the Bible. Nearby, they hung the photo of two men standing too close to be friends. One was Charles, the other, Lewis. Each visitor walked through the space slowly, some silent, others weeping. A veteran from Missouri left a medal. A teenager from Texas whispered, "Thank you," before hugging Ethan without a word. For once, the place was full of voices, even if few were loud. One morning, just as Ethan finished watering the wildflowers outside, a man stepped out of a black car. Gray hair, charcoal suit, a briefcase that looked too formal for the countryside. "I'm Daniel Shaw," he said, "executor of Charles Bennett's original will." Ethan stood still, not understanding at first. "There's something you should know," the man said, handing him a sealed envelope. "Your grandfather wrote a version before his final stroke. It never saw court. Inside was a copy of the original testament, clear, direct, unmistakable. Charles had left the majority of his estate land, savings, even the family home, to Ethan, to continue what I could not finish," the letter added in his shaky handwriting. But that version had been quietly replaced. Years ago, when Charles fell ill, Ethan's mother had used her power of attorney to draft a new one that split everything equally among the rest and left Ethan only the stable. A footnote: Ethan didn't cry. He didn't rage. He folded the papers carefully and said, almost to himself, "She thought money was the legacy. She never understood what really mattered." He didn't pursue a lawsuit. He didn't want to reclaim the family estate. Instead, he walked to the front of the stable and hung a wooden sign just below the old iron horseshoe. It read, "Legacy doesn't need proof. It only needs someone brave enough to tell it." Later that day, he and Miles sat on the hayloft steps, watching dusk paint shadows across the field. A breeze passed between them, light and familiar. Ethan turned and smiled. "We weren't the first to marry here," he said, "but we're the first to be seen." What about you? Have you ever felt erased for being true to yourself? Tell us in the comments, because your story deserves to be remembered. And if this touched something inside you, follow us for more stories that reclaim the heart.